Natasha, I'm going to start with you. Why is including Black Canadian contributions to the history curriculum important?
It's very important because it presents a more accurate history of Canada. It really locates people of African descent within this project that we call Canada and its evolution, its growth over time. And again, really then helps people to understand that we've been here for a very long time, 400 years alongside European colonization.
Greg, many people will say Black history is Canadian history. Why do you think it's important that we add these contributions to our history curriculum?
It's interesting. You just said part of what I was going to say, and I think the idea of teaching history without incorporating voices is a challenge. I encourage my students to understand that part of what we do in teaching history is unlearning. You can't learn until you unlearn. And I think part of the problem that we've faced with over the last how many decades is putting ourselves in a situation where we can actually learn true history and understand that there have been voices that haven't been heard for so long, and those voices need to be a part of our Canadian narrative.
As we know, the curriculum was slated to roll out last year, but was delayed until September 2026. Now, some critics say that the pause was a reflection of political discomfort with progressive curriculum content. I want to get both of your takes on it. Natasha, what do you think?
Well, we can read that in several ways. Yes, you can read it as, and wonder, is it because of some level of discomfort given the wider political climate of the time? Or we can also, take a step back and think that maybe and hopefully that the ministry wants to produce something of high quality, which requires more time for the review process, to gather feedback, to implement, any immaterial that they receive from experts. And so, I'm hoping in the second stream that that there will be something produced of high quality and that they needed the time in order to do so.
Now, Greg, before I come to you, I should mention that Minister Calandra did mention that the pause was necessary for both to allow for the introduction of a more consistent province-wide approach to the curriculum, but also to, as you mentioned, to ensure teachers can have the time they need to properly implement that in their classroom. As someone who's in the classroom, you know that when curriculum is given to you, when there's changes, time is needed as well. Yes. But what are your thoughts about sort of that pause and sort of the reasoning?
I think I'd echo what Natasha said earlier as well. I think the pause potentially, or I'd like to think that the pause was done with the intention of equipping educators with the proper resources. I think the unfortunate reality is most Black educators approach Black History Month with excitement, but also with a little bit of trepidation. I think the reality is that when we collectively as Black educators become the source of knowledge, it's almost like we have to be the ones telling the story. And telling the story can be traumatic. So I think I'd like to think that this pause maybe gives a necessary opportunity to ensure that all teachers can have access to resources so that it's not about saying, hey, what was your experience like? Because that happens all the time. And there are a lot of students who experience that trauma when there might be the only ones in the class and the teacher looks to them and says, hey, by the way, what's your experience like being a Black Canadian? It's hard. It's really hard.
And if I just add to that to say, with the pause, it's the pause for the actual release of what the learning topics will be, and that in that interim, there are also curating and developing some resources. And then once those are rolled out, then there should be some training. And you talked about, Black teachers who have, for a long time, been consistent in teaching Black history, and there has been an unevenness. And I think there's also an important thing to think about, that teachers require more training, especially when the teaching population is majority white. That there will be, as you had said before, a lot of unlearning and new learning that will need to take place for educators in order for them to bring this to the classroom.
Definitely.
All right, let's talk about what's being taught right now in the classroom. Greg, how would you assess how Black history is currently taught in Ontario schools?
I can only speak to my high school experience. Again, I didn't need someone to mandate or place in front of me the expectation of teaching Black history.
And what do you teach? Let's go clarify.
So I teach grade 10 Canadian history, and I also teach a social justice course at the grade 12 level as well. And so incorporating Black history into these lessons, I think it's crucial. If we are only talking about the Black narrative from a trauma-based perspective or from a woe is them perspective, then we don't necessarily get the true history of the contributions of Black Canadians to the over 400 years. You talk to many kids and they'll tell you about the Underground Railroad.
Right.
Our journey didn't begin with the Underground Railroad. I think that's important that we acknowledge that and we give educators the opportunity to have that narrative a part of our story.
I am curious. I want to be in your classroom right now, sitting amongst your students. What are you teaching me?
You know what? I'm teaching you to hear the voices that haven't been heard. I'm teaching you an opportunity to recognize that we currently, in today's day and age, are a part of history, and our story goes far back. I tell my students all the time that everyone, unless you're a member of our First Nation, Métis, or Inuit population, has an immigration story.
Right.
And I think that immigration story is what makes Canada a true nation, a nation of builders.
Natasha, so let's go back. How would you assess how Black history is currently being taught in Ontario schools?
Well, I would say that it's very uneven for a variety of reasons. From, for example, the view that they're teaching Black history should be taught focusing on the student population. And so if you have a Black presence in your school, then you can teach Black history. But if you don't have a Black presence, then there's no need to. And that is a very myopic view of teaching Black history because, as we talked about before, Black Canadian history is Canadian history. There's also a way in which the Black Canadian experience is often used to prop up the dominant Canadian narrative. So in fact, there isn't a focus on Black history, on Black individuals, on Black communities. It's used in a way to, for example, glorify Canada as a place of freedom for freedom seekers during the Underground Railroad era. But we never learn, or they never delve into who those individuals were, what their community experiences were like. And so there's that. And there's also a concern or some level of trepidation around addressing the realities of structural barriers that Canadian society imposed upon Black people and how they responded to and reacted and helped to change that. And so there is a level of discomfort there. And then one last thing I would say is that the framing of who Black Canada was. And over 400 years, there are different waves, forced migration under chattel slavery, immigration, but also that Black people are diverse in their experiences and their origins, and that oftentimes people don't name Black Canadians as Black Canadians, but often as African Americans,
right, yes.
which is another thing that we still have a long way to go.
I want to get into sort of the curriculum's grades, or specific 7, 8, and 10. Help us understand, is this being covered adequately in primary and junior grades? I'll come to Natasha first and I'll...
Sure. Well, no, a very simple answer in the sense that, ideally there would be specific expectations woven into or integrated throughout the curriculum. Grades 7, 8, and 10, the rationale for choosing that is that's when there's a focus on the actual subject of history. And so from grades 1 to 6 is social studies, and then 7, 8, and then 10 are the grades in which there are specific history subjects that are taught. And so that would be the rationale for selecting those grades.
Is there an opportunity there?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's opportunities throughout. I've been teaching, this is my area of expertise. I've been teaching from kindergarten through to now university, and there's ample opportunities to integrate Black Canadian history throughout.
Now, Greg, by the time they get to you in grade 10, for some people, perhaps they only have what you mentioned, the Underground Railroad, as an example of Black history.
Right.
Should Black history be mandated in primary grades as well? Is there an opportunity?
I would completely agree with Natasha. I think the challenge that we face is not necessarily locating Black history in history. I think we believe that when you teach history, it has to be in a history course. But let's be serious. When we talk about the contributions of Black Canadians, it's not just in the areas of history. It's science and technology. It's in medicine. It's in literature. It's in politics. So why are we just locating a curriculum in a course that just says it's a history course? Why aren't we doing this in the sciences? Why aren't we doing this in the maths? Why aren't we doing, again, we talk about learning and unlearning. There are a lot of names that we learn as mathematicians, as scientists, and we learn them as the source of, well, this is who created this. And well, let's pull back a couple layers now and really look.
Well, with that being said, Natasha, I have to ask, who gets to decide on what to include and what not to exclude from the history?
And that's a very good question. Curriculum is policy, right? And so that it's the Ministry of Education who's responsible for designating that, with the support and direction of classroom teachers, experts in the various fields, as well as input from community members. And there's a feedback process depending on which stage of the curriculum it's in. And you have that back and forth. And then the ultimate decision in terms of what is produced and dispensed to classroom teachers is the Ministry of Education.
Greg, as someone who's in the classroom, are you part of these consultations as well?
It's interesting. I think you really hit that triad. You talk about government, you talk about educators, and you talk about community partners in that feedback process. I personally have not been a part of that process. I'm not saying that other educators haven't, but I would really like to see that active process really be a little more transparent, so that if you are an educator and you are interested in this and you can be a part of it, then you should be. But you're right, it is policy. And at the end of the day, all those parties need to be able to come together to integrate effectively.
Natasha, what would you say is the biggest roadblock to changing the curriculum for broader representation of history?
The biggest roadblock is will. Right, on different levels. And so whether it's at the Ministry of Education level, because there's never been one thing that all students in Ontario have to learn about the 400-year presence of Black people in Canada. It's always been an option by individual teachers and principals, families. And so you need to have the will at that level and the consistency, as well as school board levels and in the classroom as well, to see again that, yes, it's good that it becomes part of the official curriculum, but just by the nature of wanting to represent a truthful history of Canada, that the Black narrative should be included.
Greg?
I would say there are two major roadblocks. Number one is misconception. I think misconception is huge when it comes to understanding how we implement curriculum. This idea of whose story is being told and how is that story being told. I think we also have this idea of I don't know enough. And so when you talk about individual choice, if I was teaching math and I didn't know enough about quadratics, I'd learn. If I was teaching chemistry and I didn't know enough about Boyle's Law, I'd learn. But I think we allow individuals to say, I don't know enough, and that excuses them from having to implement certain ideas. When you look at misconception, the pushback when you had the renaming of John A. Macdonald schools, people believe that, well, when you rename a school, what you're doing is you're rewriting history. Right. We're not rewriting history. We're just trying to pull back more layers to allow true history to be told.
I do want to ask, if you had the minister, Paul Calandra, sitting across from us at this table, what would you tell him about sort of the broader additions of Black history to our curriculum and sort of those roadblocks that you bring up?
Well, I would say that this is a long overdue step based on decades of advocacy from Black parents, community members, educators, and that we should see it not as the ultimate step, but as one step and of several that needs to be taken in order to continuously and to better represent. History is one subject, but as Greg has mentioned earlier, that there needs to be integration and recognition in all subject areas.
Greg?
You know, we've often heard the broader the base, the taller the tower. And I think it's very important. Foundations are huge. First steps are good, but we have to be intentional in making sure that we're not just doing this to check a box. We're doing this to be intentional about how we move forward. There has to be a long-term plan.
All right, and in the last few minutes that we have, I want to know, what is your favorite, not widely known piece of Black history? Natasha?
That's a very hard question. For me, I would say that I've, for the past few years, been focusing quite a bit more on Black history in Ontario, and I'm amazed to continuously learn about Black people being all across the province. We often think about like the Black communities in Chatham and Windsor, and in major cities like Toronto, but Black people since the 1800s have resided and lived in all places, in northern mines and in a range of places. So for me, I think that that's something that's quite interesting.
Geography
Not
at
well
all.
known.
Okay, Greg?
Interesting. I try to do a task with my students that encourages them to investigate communities. And I go to Montreal, and the idea of we all connect jazz to the United States, but the jazz scene in Montreal has been rich for years. And you get an individual like Rufus Rockhead, a Jamaican immigrant who comes here, defies many odds and becomes the source of jazz in Montreal, even to the point where during Prohibition, during the Great Depression, where nothing was really happening south of the border, all of the greats were coming here. The Billie Holidays, the Sammy Davis Jr.'s, the Louis Armstrongs, they were all coming to Montreal, and it's a vibrant, Little Burgundy, right? Vibrant communities that we have here for sure.
Very interesting. All right, in honor of Black History Month, we asked each of you to recommend one resource for our viewers and listeners. Natasha, you were doing something cool at the Archives of Ontario. Tell us about Illuminate Black, the
Yes.
exhibition.
Working with, I'm curating an exhibit called Illuminate Black, shining a light on the Black presence in Ontario, working with Blue Rhino Design. This exhibit is going to be opening up at the end of this month, and will be running for 2 years at the Archives of Ontario, just giving a wonderful overview of lesser-known stories of Black history in Ontario.
Greg?
There's a series, a BLK series, produced by Sud Sutherland and Jennifer Holness, and it is a great 4-part docuseries that really, we talk about the 400 years, and it really tells the history. It tells the story, the unknown stories of the Black Canadian experience beyond the stereotypical Underground Railroad, and it really documents time and place, and it gives both a historical, a social commentary, but also looks at geography and the role that different locations from coast to coast have played in really cultivating a strong Black Canadian presence.
And that's BLK and Origin Story,
Yes,
correct?
Origin
All
Stories.
right. Natasha, Greg, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for your insights.
Great,
Thank you very
you.
much.
Thank
Great.